Thank you for coming out on a lovely Saturday morning to hear one of Osher's premier lectures. You're welcome. My name is Tom Blinkhorn, and I'm with Osher, and I have the great privilege of introducing my neighbor and friend, David Bisno. Is there anyone in the audience that does not know who David Bisno is? Okay, well, David Bisno is a polymath. He knows that when he gets his teeth into a subject, he will know that subject and he can convey it and lecture about it in a way that will mesmerize you. So you're in for a real treat today. David is from St. Louis, went to Harvard, went back to St. Louis for his ophthalmology training, worked in that field for many years, and then discovered everything else. Science, the whole issue of time. I mean, you name it, this guy has done it. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce my friend, David Bisno. David.
Thank you, neighbor Tom.
I had the right hip. A new one.
All of this started unplanned. I hadn't planned on doing any lectures this autumn until a few weeks ago. You may have noticed, perhaps, the front page of the Valley News came out a few weeks ago with this picture of somebody by the name of Jeff Acker I had never heard of, and a sign he had put up apparently in his neighborhood on Greensboro Road entitled "Hanover Residents, Town Officials at Odds Over Roadside Placards Protesting a Church." And that got my attention immediately. And I said, cool, this is something I want to look into. And so that's what I've done almost nonstop since this article came out. And then, more recently, the next Valley News article was "Church Deal Disappoints Neighbors," which added fuel to the situation. The first one was mostly about signs. The second one has something to do with the church. And then Jim Kenyon comes out with a third article about the sign on the New Hampshire liquor store down in West Leb, which you may or may not know about. And so I had three local situations going on which prompted me to think about this and get into it, and it occurred to me that this would be a ripe thing to discuss in this community, because it's not often that some really interesting constitutional law issues come to focus in one tiny small community. But that is exactly what's happening now, so I thought I'd have fun sharing this with you. So this was the front of the newspaper, the Valley News, that got me started on this, and apparently there was some controversy over signs that appeared along the street. So what I'm going to now do is focus on two different topics. The first, and they both have to do with the First Amendment of our Constitution. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. That's the first half. The second half is still the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, but more importantly for us, or prohibiting the free exercise of religion. So one has to do with speech, one has to do with religion. And giving you the big picture now of what I'm going to try to do today is paint a picture for you of the interplay in Hanover of the relationship between what we call neutral rules of general applicability, which I hopefully, by the time you leave this morning, you will have a total understanding of what is a neutral rule of general applicability, and how those laws interface in Hanover with speech and with the free exercise of religion. So that's the big picture today of what I want to achieve. The interplay of what's called NRGA, neutral rules of general applicability, speech, and religion. So, you all know that we are welcome to Hanover from whichever direction you come by a sign that welcomes you to Hanover. And neither Faye nor I have never been so aware of signs around town as we are now as we enter and leave town. So let's be sure we understand that signs are an expression of speech. They are a form of speech, and expressing yourself on a sign is no different than you're speaking. That's a given. And here we are. This was a sign that was put up. In fact, many of these signs, particularly along one of the roads in Hanover, Greensboro Road. So what are the rules that govern what kind of laws can be passed regulating speech? I'm going to go over this very quickly just to give you an overview, and you'll see how it applies in Hanover. These have to do with laws or statutes that might be passed in Congress or in Concord, New Hampshire, or in Hanover, New Hampshire by the local board here. One, there could be a neutral rule of general applicability, which would be like no signs visible after 8 o'clock at night, or no signs on Main Street. That would be a general rule, like no parking between 5 and 8, or drive 50 miles an hour. That's a general rule that applies to everybody. It's a neutral rule that applies to everybody. The second might be a statute that is subject-based, such as no signs in Hanover that are in favor of a Republican, or no signs in Hanover a subject-based would be no signs in Hanover having to do with politics. That would be subject-based. No signs in Hanover having to do with education. That would be subject-based. No signs in Hanover having to do with travel. That would be subject-based. But there could be a statute passed in some communities that say no signs that favor Democrats, or no signs that favor or disfavor the Catholic Church. That would be a viewpoint restriction. So one is a neutral rule of general applicability, controlling signs, but that apply to everybody equally. The second would be subject-based. That would be a statute interfering with a certain subject. And the third would be a statute that would interfere with a point of view. Okay? Now, how are those judged? Let's talk about neutral rules of general applicability first. An NRGA are laws that generally regulate time, place, and manner. And if you think about that in one way or another, all neutral rules of general applicability have to do with time, place, and manner. Not picking out subject, not picking out point of view. And within that category are signs equivalent to speech. A neutral rule of general applicability regulates time, place, or manner, and someone says, well, I don't like that law. I'm going to take it to court. I don't like that neutral rule. And so what the judges will look at and decide, did the legislature, which passed the law, or the select board, have a rational basis for passing that law? And if they had a rational basis for doing so, then the law is valid. Whether you like it or not is immaterial. They had a rational basis, which is a very easy. What would be a law for which one could not make a rational basis? A neutral rule. Anybody? Come on, hypotheticals.
No dogs allowed.
No dogs allowed on Main Street. Okay, well, I don't know. Maybe you could have a rational basis for that. But how about a law that says no walking backwards on Sundays on Main Street? Okay? That would be really hard. What kind of rational basis could be for that? That would be craziness. But dogs, maybe. but you get the idea. So a neutral rule of general applicability simply has to satisfy, when it's challenged, did the people who wrote the law have a rational basis for doing so? Whether you like it or not is immaterial. And if they did, then the law stands. Okay, but now, what about subject-based restriction? Like no signs on travel, no signs on politics, no signs on some subject. Can there be such restrictions? Well, yes, there can be, but when you challenge them, what does the court look at? They look at that law, a subject-based restriction of speech or signs, with what's called strict scrutiny. And strict scrutiny means, did the state, Hanover, the select board, have a compelling interest to limit that to that subject matter, and does their restriction apply to as few people as possible? Is it narrowly tailored? If it can satisfy those, the restriction's okay. And I will tell you parenthetically, it's very difficult, very, very difficult to overcome strict scrutiny. It's a very tough standard. And you're going to see how this plays out in Hanover right now. The third any questions about that? Because I want you to stop me as we go. Because this is going to build. I know where I'm going. And I want you to stop me if you don't get it. Are we okay? In the back? We're okay? All right. The third category, understanding signs are speech, is a restriction of viewpoint. And if any sign or speech is restricted by a statute, you don't even have to take it to court. It's unconstitutional. There is no allowance in the United States for a statute restricting viewpoint. Okay? There's no test. It's unconstitutional. You don't have to go to court. And you'll see this play out every once in a while in the newspapers. So, in summary, you could have a neutral rule of general applicability, the test for which is rational basis. The test is rational basis. And do you know what I mean by the test? The test occurs in court. The court has to decide, did the legislators have a rational basis? Okay, if it's subject-based, the test is strict scrutiny, which has to satisfy two criteria. The state has to have a compelling interest in restricting subject, and it has to affect as few people as possible. It's almost, not quite, but very, very difficult to pass strict scrutiny. And the third, viewpoint-based restriction, 0. Not allowed in the United States. Okay, now let's turn to Hanover quickly and see what happens, because what I'm going to do is signs for the first half of the talk, but it's not going to be half. It's a little bit, and then we're going to get into the really dicey stuff. So there are signs, which I've learned about, in Hanover, statutes that control signs. And I got turned on to this by these signs on Greensboro Road. So I decided to go up to the select board and the zoning offices, and I will tell you they were really nice. Everybody's been super nice to me up there. But they've gotten to the point that, oh my God, here comes David Bisno again. But they're super nice, and I'll share with you a little bit later that perhaps I might have had a slight effect, not too much, but a slight effect by going up there so often. But they now know me, and they say, okay, what do you want to look at now? And it becomes very obvious in reading through their ordinances, and it's very easy to do this. You can go up and get their list of ordinances. They're happy to hand it to anyone, which are all their statutes and restrictions about signs in Hanover. And one quickly learns and appreciates as you drive around town that the select board, the zoning people in Hanover, want to keep this the beautiful, quiet, idyllic village that it is. And it's pretty here. And there's a reason why it's pretty here. It's controlled. Whereas in West Leb, there are signs like this, or like this, that all of us know, where there are two gigantic signs saying the same thing. And you wonder, how redundant do you have to be to get your message across? And how big does a sign have to be? And you immediately realize when you think about this that Hanover has this controlled. Well, to what extent do they have it controlled? How many signs are allowed as you drive down the street, right? And I don't know, you may have a different view of aesthetics, but I don't think that this is particularly visually appealing. Well, apparently either do the zoning people in the select board of Hanover, and for years this kind of thing has not been allowed. Or how about this? It's certainly a lot of information, but remember, this isn't Hanover, right? And it's a work of art. Well, it's sort of how you interpret it. And I will tell you, the other day I was walking in front of the Hopkins Center and the Hanover Inn, and you know, there's a little place for the bus stop where you can go in if it's raining. There's a little glassed-in little place there, and every day there are more posters up there. And I really think whoever is doing that is trying to compete with this, and we'll see how long that lasts and how many posters are put up in that little closed-in area. So it's a matter of aesthetics, what the town is going to allow. I don't know of any place in Hanover that looks like this, except Cumming is a little place where you wait for the bus in front of Hopkins Center. And then, of course, I just love this one in front of Danowitz, which is absolutely a viewpoint, right? That's a viewpoint. And in Norwich, Vermont, it's on a private property, and it's expressing a viewpoint. And I don't know, I haven't looked at any of the ordinances in Norwich for or against or controlling signs, but I love this. This is the epitome of a viewpoint. Right? And I'm sorry?
Viewpoint, best ale.
That's a viewpoint too, right? Okay. So then one has to wonder, as you walk down the street in Hanover, how many accessory signs are allowed? And how many freestanding signs? And I will tell you, there are ordinances on all of this. It's really interesting. Go up and get a copy, and you'll see, you know, just how many signs can this bookstore put up? Or how many signs in a window? Is 1 okay? Is 5 okay? Are 10 too much? Etc. And then, of course, and I've been always fascinated by this, Hanover has an ordinance that no sign anywhere in the town of Hanover can be lit from the inside. And so you'll notice that every sign in Hanover, if you can see it at night, it has a light shining on it. But there can be no signs lit from the inside. So for instance, in West Leb, this is a sign that's lit from the inside. And you know very well when you're leaving Queechee, and you've been at Simon Pierce for dinner and you're coming home, and you'll pass the mobile station on your left side before you turn onto 89, that there's a very bright gasoline station sign that tells you the cost of the gallon of gasoline, just as it is here. But this isn't allowed in Hanover. The sign has to be this. So this is not, they had to take the bulbs out of the inside of this sign in Hanover and light it with that external light that shines on the co-op gasoline sign to comply with the standards of Hanover. And then, of course, is the curious situation where you drive down past the hospital and you see this Jesse sign on the left. And you say, God, that's a lit sign. That's not allowed. How can that be? But if you come from the other direction, you see this sign, and it's not lit from the inside. This is lit from the outside. And so you wonder, how could that be? Well, after studying these ordinances, I figured it out. It doesn't take a Rhodes Scholar to do this. As you're driving along, here's the Hanover line between Hanover and Lebanon. We're going now north into Hanover, and you see that sign is in Hanover. So it had to be lit from the outside. But if you look the other way, the lit sign inside here is in Lebanon. And so you see the town of Hanover line goes right through Jesse's property. And so on one side of the line, they could lit up the sign from the inside. On the other side of the line, they couldn't. It's not going to make anybody's big deal difference, but I sort of thought that was fun. And then, of course, there's a regulation, and I will give you a couple of examples of how the city can get away with things that you can't. And they break their own laws, and there's a certain amount, excuse me for saying this, but there's a little bit of hypocrisy built into Hanover and New Hampshire generally. And well, what might that be? Well, they have an ordinance in Hanover, no flashing lights, right? You cannot have a mobile sign or a Molly's sign that goes Molly's, 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 or lose. That's against the law. You'd be closed down immediately. On the other hand, the city itself can put up flashing lights.
Yeah, it's a beautiful woman there.
Thank you, Faye. So I became aware that, wow, that's very good. I read the ordinance, no flashing lights, unless the city does the lights, right? Make of that as you will. That's for safety reasons. Did they have a rational basis for breaking their own law? Yeah, I guess you could argue they did have a rational basis for doing that, but it's exactly not a neutral rule of general applicability. Okay, and then, of course, there's the question of size of signs. And Hanover has very strict ordinances. I don't have to go through all of them. You can go and get a copy of how big a sign can be, either downtown, on a store, or in your front yard. And this is an example, once more, of how a jurisdiction didn't follow their own laws. So this is Westlab, as you know, and here is this new outlet, liquor outlet, with liquor and wine outlet, which is a huge sign, and even bigger is the sign going across their roof. And Jim Kenyon here wrote an article about this called Liquor Sign Sends Message. And what's the message? The message is that the city can do what you can't. So in Lebanon, it turns out that a store of this size, which is a pretty big store, is entitled to, by Lebanon law, is entitled to 147 square feet of sign. Any more than that, it comes down. It turns out that this sign that they have is 911 square feet. It's like 6 times, 7 times the size that's allowed. And so Jim Kenyon did an investigation. Well, how can you get away with that? And said, well, it's a state store. And they are getting away with what a private person can't. The state, since it's state-owned, can get away with what you're not allowed to do. And then I started thinking, why does this New Hampshire liquor store need any sign at all? Because you can't buy liquor any place but a state liquor store. So the fact is they don't need any sign. And you'd still, when you want to go buy liquor, you'd go to that, you'd learn where it is. But anyway, that's all my conjecturing. Which, of course, brings me back to my favorite story when one of my kids used to ask me, what do you think of this essay? And I'd read through it, and I would say, well, you've said what you wanted to say, but you just have too many words saying it. You don't need very, and you don't need so, and all these extra words. And then I told them to remember the Fulton Fish Market story. You all know that? No? I don't know. Okay, the Fulton Fish Market story. This has to do with writing an essay. And it's really good to share with your grandchildren. This guy's down on the Lower East Side, and he walks down to, is the Fulton Fish Market on the Lower East Side? Yeah, okay. And he goes down there, and, you know, the smells arise. And they see this big sign, fresh fish sold here today, above the Fulton Fish Market. And the guy scratches his head and says, He walks up to the owner and says, you know, fresh fish sold here today. Why would you have the word fresh on it? No one's going to sell stale or old fish, so all you need is fish. Fresh fish for sale today. So you don't need the word fresh. And then I'm not sure you need the word today. You're not talking about tomorrow, and you're not talking about yesterday. So just fish sold here. And then what about here? Why would you have a sign? Of course it's here. So get rid of here. And then now fish sold. Well, why do you need the word sold? What do you think, you're trading it? I mean, that's what you're in business, to sell fish, so you don't need sold. So now all you got left is fish. And for goodness sakes, within a block of your place, everybody can smell it. And so you don't need the fish either, so just get rid of it. And this is a very good lesson. I think of it all the time when I'm writing out something, and apply the Fulton Fish Market rule. Get rid of the words you don't need. And I thought of the same thing when I read Jim Kenyon's article, that is breaking all their own laws. And in another example, like Lebanon, the flashing lights, what the city can do or the state can do, its citizens can't do. It's not going to break the bank. It's not going to solve the Middle East crisis. But still, it's sort of an interesting thing having to do with signs. Now, talking about hypocrisy, I have to throw this in. I've done this before for some of you who've been to my lectures. I just love this one having to do with New Hampshire. You know that we all drive around with these license plates, live free or die. And I don't know how many of you think about that. But in 1976, just prior to 76, there was a guy by the name of Maynard down in Lebanon, New Hampshire, who objected to that political sign. And it has deep meanings. It's historical. There was an article a few weeks ago in the Valley News about the origins of this motto that became New Hampshire's motto, live free or die. But of course, when you go up and read the ordinances telling you this and telling you that, you wonder, how free am I to live free or die when they've got all these ordinances telling me what I can do and what I can't do? But at any rate, Maynard didn't like this, and so he drove around with a piece of tape over live free or die, and he was arrested. And he went to court, and he paid $35, and he was let go, and he went outside, and within the next 2 weeks, he was arrested again. And this happened 3 times for putting the tape over. And so it ended up going up to the Supreme Court from Lebanon, New Hampshire, objecting to live free or die. The case was called Woolley versus Maynard, 1976, the Supreme Court of the United States. And the court resoundingly said that the government, any government, cannot force a citizen to carry the government's message. And that is clearly what New Hampshire was doing. And so New Hampshire's hands were slapped, and you can't do that. Well, at the time that I learned this, I was taking a con law course at Harvard. And my car with a New Hampshire license plate from Hanover was parked on Massachusetts Avenue right outside the law school. And I'm learning about this law and the Supreme Court decision, and there's my car, and it says live free or die on it from New Hampshire. And so I came home and told Faye about it, and I decided I wanted a license plate without that. And so I drove down. At that time, the Department of Motor Vehicles was on Miracle Mile, and I drove in there. It was very nice, wearing a sport coat. But I had in my breast pocket a copy of the Supreme Court decision. And I went up to the desk and I said, ma'am, I'd like a license plate without live free or die on it. And she said, oh no, we don't have anything like that. Every license plate produced in New Hampshire since the mid-70s, since the Vietnam War, has live free or die on it. I said, well, ma'am, here's the decision from the Supreme Court that says that is unconstitutional. And she then looked at one of the armed state patrol guys and called him over and said, would you please have this guy ejected? That's me, ejected from the Department of Motor Vehicles. So I politely walked out, and I went home, and I put tape over those words, and a copy of the decision in my glove compartment of the car, so I'd always have it, hoping I'd get stopped. I wasn't. I've never been stopped. And so a number of inquiries since, and I've been at this for a long time, obviously tell us that New Hampshire absolutely disregarded the Supreme Court decision. They continue to produce the license plates. But the fact is that, like Maynard, now apparently you can put tape over it if you don't like it, and you will not get arrested. Anyway, but so much for hypocrisy of live free or die, and New Hampshire is told, and they disregard it. So it's all sort of have to do with signs. Now, what other ordinances or signs does Hanover have? Well, you know, they have banners all the time, whether it's one banner or another. And I asked about this, and who can have a banner? Well, it turns out that you can go up and apply for a banner to the select board, and if it's of general interest and they decide in their great wisdom that it's okay, then it's okay. It's up for a day or two. OSHA does it all the time, the library, et cetera, and nobody gets very excited about it. But it is a thing that is controlled, and who has the right to, what if you want to put a happy birthday to your wife up there? Where is the line between what's allowed and what's not? Well, there is no real written. It's sort of a floating crap game up there in the select board in Hanover, and they decide, does it seem right? And so it's not all that clear. But of course, you see these banners up all the time. And who can put them up? What can they say? Again, these are all being regulated. Which brings us back to why we're here at all. This particular sign with this young woman standing along the road on Greensboro Road, and that sign says, "Protect our neighborhood." But there are other signs along roadways in Hanover advertising a house for sale or for rent. Well, how many of those signs can you have? And what's allowed? Did you ever think about that? And where can the sign be placed? You see them all over. Are there regulations? Well, you know what? You bet there are. Are they enforced? Well, that's a different story. Here, if you know this yard. Everybody knows this yard. As you drive out past the co-op towards the hospital, you'll see this on the right. And within my cell phone camera, I couldn't get all of them in at the same time. But there are more than what I photographed on this lot on the way out of town. And one wonders, how close to the street corner? How close to the street can you have a sign? And what can the signs say? Well, I will tell you, they're all regulated. Now, whether anybody pays attention to them, that's something else. But there are lots of regulations, including the regulation of this sign, which the neighbors found themselves in a bitter dispute with the city, because it turns out that the city felt that they were violating the ordinance as to the placement of these signs. And here are the group that discussed this, and I have a little clip to share with you. This is the select board in Hanover on, I guess, Tuesday nights, and you guys got to listen to this very erudite conversation.
Complaint-based zoning. You know, we have 3,000 parcels of land in town. We have, a staff of 3 who do enforcement. They're not going to go house by house and say, are you in conformance with the zoning? If you get complaints, you try to address it. And so it doesn't make any sense, but I think we found a solution, and
and trying to make it possible for you guys to.
Yeah.
So, any further discussion?
We're sorry that it's been so convoluted.
I just want to make sure you've got cover with the state if the state comes in. They're not likely to, but I'm concerned they're going to come and rip out all the signs someday and say. So I will be sending them an email tomorrow. They punted it to me. We took the punt, and they're going to have to live with it.
Okay, now that's Julia Griffin, and she's the town manager. And what they were discussing, I'm sorry it's a little bit garbled, was how close to the road can a sign be? And I decided to go to that meeting because of my interest in what was happening on Greensboro Road. Irregardless of the message, they were talking about how close to the road. And what the city is concerned with, and Julia Griffin in particular, is if the sign is too close to the road and it obstructs some child coming across and the motorist doesn't see the child behind the sign, there could be a terrible accident. And so they're very concerned about it. On the other hand, I don't know what the percentage is, but some of the roads, streets in Hanover are state roads. They're controlled by the state. Some are county roads and some are city roads. It's a totally different jurisdiction. And it is totally unclear to the public whether you're on a state road, a county road, or a city road. And the city of Hanover has no jurisdiction to move a sign on a state road. And I can tell you that the state of New Hampshire has other things to do than sending patrol officers all the time up and down every straight road in every city in New Hampshire with a tape measure measuring how far from the edge of the road the sign is. And I found this sort of curious. And so after everyone was finished bringing their thoughts and gripes to the select board, is there any other business? And I said, well, I raised my hand. And I sat down at the table and I asked them whether they could just make it clear for me, how far from the street can your sign be? And Julia Griffin looked at me and she says, you know, Dr. Bisno, we know where you live. And she said, your mailbox is too close to the street. I was shocked that maybe because I had been interested in going to the select board meeting, they were going to come and move my mailbox. And she said, well, you know, it gets in the way of the snowplows. And I said, well, is my street a county street, a city street, a state street? And essentially, I can tell you, it's a floating crap game as to who knows what, as to what street is controlled by what. I'm sure they do, but we don't. And so far, my mailbox is still standing there, and I guess it's okay. But the other day, I went out to get the mail, and I looked around, and I saw this is the corner, and there are 3 signs within inches. One for sale sign, and these 2 signs are within inches, and these are city or state or county signs. And they are absolute in violation of the 10-foot back that signs are supposed to be on one's lawn. Now, for fun, in thinking about how far back a sign has to be, I remembered driving along the Highway 66 and noticing these Burma Shave signs. You remember these? Well, let me remind you what they looked like. Twould be more fun to go by air. If we could put these signs up there. Burma Shave. There's a better one coming. He tried to cross as the fast train neared. Death did not draft him. He volunteered. So Remember those signs along 66? Everywhere. Okay, so this comes back to what kind of statutes does Hanover have about signs on private property, which affects all of us. And we go about our daily business. You have a question? You have a question?
No, I'm sorry. She's looking at my yard.
Okay, you recognize the neighborhood. Okay, so let's talk for just a minute about what Hanover requires on private property. And let me first go back and remind you of a recent Supreme Court case. This case, Reed versus Gilbert, the decision written by Clarence Thomas, and this is just 4 years ago, was a unanimous decision coming from Arizona. Unanimous, which stated, a town's sign ordinance which restricts subject or content must pass strict scrutiny, which is exactly what I told you when we started. If the restriction is subject-based, what? What's the test? I'm sorry? Strict scrutiny, which means that the government who passed the ordinance must have a compelling interest in the restriction, and it has to affect as few people as possible. Unanimous from the Supreme Court, affecting every community in the United States, so that any sign, any statute which restricts signs on the basis of subject or content must pass this very high bar. And if it doesn't, the sign's okay. That's the decision. Now, what do Hanover sign ordinances say? What if you had a sign that says, I love apple pie? Or a sign that, I love my wife and children? Would those be okay? Or would the town take objection to it? How about this one? Would they take objection to it? It turns out that Hanover does have ordinances, and when I first walked up there, let me just go back. When I first walked up there to get the ordinances, the rule was with yard signs, as of a few weeks ago, that other than signs for rent or for sale, or political signs within a certain time span of a primary or an election, so much time before and so much time after, which were allowed. And you could put up political signs, you could put up signs that you want to sell or rent your property. But no other signs were allowed that could be seen from the street or by your neighbors. I started thinking about it now, wait a minute. If nobody from the street can see my sign and my neighbors can't see the sign, what the hell's good the sign? Well, you can put it in your backyard where nobody can see. That's okay. Or you could put it inside. And that seemed to me, it's not a restriction of content or subject, but it's a restriction of how many or how effective. And that seemed to fly in the sense that the only reason for justifying that was aesthetics, that we don't want to clutter up the neighborhood with signs. And the city's rule of a few weeks ago was that you couldn't not put up any signs that would be visible from the street or your neighbors. And I made repeated trips up to the select board and discussed this with them. And it turns out that just about 10 days ago, I went up there again, and I was told they've changed their zoning. And now the rule is that you can have 2 signs. Now, whether it's due to David Bisno, I don't know. I don't know, but it was changed, or it's about to be changed. You can have 2 signs visible from anywhere, but they have to be such a size, a normal size, and there can be 2. And I turned to the head of the zoning board, and I said, wait a minute, isn't that a limitation of free speech? As to how much speech? And he said, Dr. Bisno, you can put as much speech as you want on the 2 signs. You know, write small. And you could write as much as you want on 2 signs. Well, so there you have it. But then as I kept driving around, I looked at flags. And, you know, they're waving and getting attention, and they're all over, these nice flags. So I asked about flags. And sure enough, they're in the ordinance about flags. And it turns out that the ordinance is, I think it's sort of cool. Hanover will allow an unlimited number of flags of states, nations, or government entities. You can have 8 United States flags, or 5 Syrian flags, or any number. You can have flags of the select board, Hanover Select Board, and you put up 8 flags, regardless of how aesthetically unpleasing that might be. But any flag, and you can put up, obviously, a New Hampshire flag, as many as you wish, of a state, government entity, or nation. You could put up 5 Israeli flags, or Pakistani flags, or Turkish flags. Nothing is said. You could put up 10 Turkish flags praising Erdogan, and nothing would be said. But how about flags like these that somebody might want to put up? How would the Hanover treat that? And, you know, I just throw this as an example of other kinds of flags that people put up. It turns out that this has all been thought about to keep Hanover aesthetically pleasing. And flags, other than state, nation, and government entity, are classified as signs. And so now you can have 2. You can have 1 flag and 1 sign, or you can have 2 signs, or you can have 2 flags. But flags other than state, nation, and government entity are considered signs. And so you can have 2.
David, that seems so arbitrary. Why 2? Why not 1 or 3?
Diane, I'll meet you there next Tuesday night, and we'll talk about it. And so this is the great wisdom of what's going on. And listen, you drive through Hanover, it looks pretty here. The leaves are nice, quiet, it's nice. But there's underlying is this little problem of free speech. And one could make a big case out of it. Well, so how is this enforced? Well, it was very clearly explained to me in a very, very nice manner, because I asked about it. And Hanover functions on the compliance is complaint-based enforcement. So nothing happens. My mailbox is still standing there until I suppose the snowplow guys call up, or my neighbors call up. And so essentially, you know, you could argue we're back in East Germany with the Stasi, and they're counting on neighbors, tattling on neighbors. And essentially that's what it is. And no one will do anything from this unless they get a phone call that I don't like my neighbor's sign. And then you'd have to delve on and pull it apart a little bit. Does my neighbor not like my sign because of its size, its location, or its message? There's the rub. There's the rub. And so now we come back to that sign, and this young woman standing there, and we ask, about what is Laura upset? This is the end of my first part of the program. It turns out that Laura is here in the room, And she's going to speak to us with her husband, Jeff. But first, you're invited for refreshments. Faye, are they out there? John, are we okay out there?
I haven't looked, but I smell a coffee.
Okay, let's take a break. Enjoy your coffee, and we'll come back and hear about Laura. Okay, I should ask you whether we're okay up to this point. Any questions, comments? I want to address any questions you might have about statutes, and generally statutes restricting free speech, and we know that signs are speech. And of course, what nags in the back of my mind before we go on to the more cogent part of the program today, which is religion, is, I mentioned that the second tier of possible restrictions of signs or speech is subject or content-based. And in order to have a content-based restriction, that has to pass strict scrutiny. Otherwise, it's unconstitutional to restrict. And one could make the argument, I haven't done so in City Hall because I don't think it's worth it. And I also like a quiet, pretty neighborhood. But when the select board says that you can have political signs, but not Black Lives Matter signs, or you can have a state message, but not a Fenway Park message, that's controlling content. No question about it. It's subject-based restriction. And when it says you can have for rent signs, but you can't have signs saying, I love my wife, that's subject-based restriction. And if that were challenged, I don't think it's worth challenging. But when one goes up to City Hall here in the select board, one is very acutely aware that these folks, Tom?
I have a question in a minute.
Okay. One is acutely, it's always nice for me, Tom, to know in advance that you're going to have a question. I get prepared. Or I try to. Now I have no idea what I was talking about. I was going to say that when one goes up to the meetings, one is acutely aware that these folks are doing their best to thread this needle between what is required, what is correct, what is legally correct, and maintaining a nice functioning village. And they're doing their best. And it's not easy. And when I asked Rob Hausman, who's the zoning commissioner, to come this morning, he said, oh, I've had it by 5 o'clock Friday, I've had enough, I'm getting out of here, I'm going fishing or going somewhere. Have fun. They do their best, and I have nothing but compliments for how they try to manage a difficult situation. Okay, Tom.
I have a question about flags, David. I noticed when you were showing flags, there was one flag that was missing, and that has been the subject of a lot of controversy in different parts of the country, the Confederate flag. Does the Confederate flag have any special status or non-status in this part of the world that you know of?
With regard to Hanover, the rule is that you can have as many flags as you wish of a state, a nation, or a government entity. Well, a nation that was, or a state that was, the Habsburg flag or the Confederate flag, that's historical. And so if you want to have 2 of those, that's fine, but then no signs. I don't think that would, I would argue that does not fall, or the city would argue that does not fall into a functioning nation, state, or government entity category. Any other, yeah.
Could a state pass a law that said a particular flag was detrimental to the society as a whole? and restrict it to, for instance, a Confederate flag might be put acceptable in a museum as a historical icon, but that it wouldn't be acceptable hanging from someone's house because it's, for many people, many people, it's a sign of hate. And is that something the state could do on?
Well, would that could be argued, would be a viewpoint restriction, right? And by your question, you even indicated that for many it's a symbol of hate. And we are free to hate. That's a viewpoint. And on its face, restrictions of viewpoint are unconstitutional. Whether you like it or don't like it, and you have to get over what is very, very common by many people, say, because I don't like something, that should be unconstitutional. That's baby talk. Diane?
What is the punishment if you have a sign and you're told to take it off? What is the mechanism?
Diane asks, what's the punishment if your neighbor calls the city and says you've got 6 flags up or 6 signs up? What's the punishment? I'm not sure the select board has even thought about that yet.
Actually, David, I know the answer to that.
Oh, okay.
So the ordinance allows up to, it would be a civil violation, you can be fined up to $275 per day per sign. Which is what we were threatened with.
And Jeff,
That's why I know that.
that's why we're here and why that was written, because Jeff knows firsthand about that. Thank you. Okay, so now we are going to, why don't you just have a seat? I'll call you.
Yeah, okay.
Because it's going to be time. Okay. You want to hold on to this?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So now I want to turn to the second half of what we're going to discuss, and that is the free exercise of religion and how that comes into play with neutral rules of general applicability. And to get this, you got to really understand neutral rules of general applicability. And you saw how neutral rules affect speech and signs, right? We okay on that? Time, place, and manner. Not content and not viewpoint, but time, place, and manner restrictions. Those are neutral rules of general applicability. And now we're going to turn to neutral rules of general applicability, laws across the locality, the state, or the nation that affect everybody equally. And we're going to see how this now interacts with the First Amendment's right to the free exercise of religion. So again, reminding you, neutral rules of general applicability, abbreviated NRGA, so you'll know from now on, because it's going to appear, and we looked at them in terms of zoning ordinances. Those are all neutral rules of general applicability. And now, that's what we looked at were zoning laws, and for those, you simply ask, did the governing body have a rational basis for passing the law? So now let's look at history a little bit and understand how this has evolved. And the interesting story to go back to occurred out in Utah, when in the mid-1800s, the Mormons got kicked out of Missouri and headed west to find some place where they could practice their religion, which was then called the Mormon religion, now Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And they ended up in Utah, and one of the things that was part of their religion and devout belief was, part of their religion was that it was okay to have more than one wife. And that was part of their religion. This bothered people in Washington because it flew in the face of federal laws which stated, they were neutral rules of general applicability, which stated one wife at a time. Isn't that right? Help me if it's not. One wife at a time. And interestingly enough, the law was written, the Anti-Bigamy Act of 1862 was put through Congress by Vermont Senator Justin Morrill. So it has a Vermont basis of this law, which outlawed bigamy or polygamy. That is a neutral rule of general applicability that applies to everybody. But the Mormons argued that that's part of the free exercise of our religion. And your neutral rule of general applicability is denying us the free exercise of our religion as guaranteed to us by the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So we've got two forces absolutely opposed to each other. Got it? A neutral rule and free exercise.
Joseph Smith was also Vermont.
Joseph Smith was from Vermont also?
Yeah.
Did he know your grandfather? Okay. Okay. And so that dispute ended up at the Supreme Court in 1878, Reynolds versus the United States. And the decision there was that a neutral rule of general applicability trumps the free exercise of religion. Okay? So people can have all kinds of beliefs. But when push comes to shove and there's a case, the neutral rule, if it interferes with their free exercise, the neutral rule wins. And polygamy in this case, polygamy, can no longer be practiced, and the free exercise loses to the neutral rule of general applicability, which in this case is rules of marriage. Okay. Are we with? And what I want you to clearly keep in mind, because I know where we're going, is the neutral rule versus free exercise. That's what it's all about. All right. Neutral rule versus the free exercise of religion. That isn't to say that there aren't people today who don't like the decision and who would still like to practice polygamy. And here is such a group, and they caused a fuss a few years ago. Well, they caused a fuss, but it didn't go anywhere because of this decision by the Supreme Court. However, the next big turning point was in 1972 when the Amish felt that their religion dictated to them that their children needed to be homeschooled to really get the right religion, and it violated their religious tenets if they sent their children to public school. And there were rules across the United States that every child's supposed to go to school through the 12th grade. And the Amish didn't like this. And they fought the case all the way up to the Supreme Court on the basis that the free exercise of their religion should trump the neutral rule of general applicability. No different than the marriage polygamy case in Utah. In Yoder versus Wisconsin, the Supreme Court did a 180-degree shift and made the decision that in this case, religion would trump a neutral rule of general applicability, which opened the door for children to be homeschooled to whatever extent the parents wanted, following the free exercise of their religion, and to ignore the neutral rule of general applicability about all children going to school up to a certain age or grade. Okay? This is a really big, important turning point for the Supreme Court, which many people applauded, and many people thought it was one of the worst decisions ever by the Supreme Court. All right. So then, let's go to 1990. And as you know, particularly with the opioid crisis today, the United States has laws about controlled substances. Cocaine, heroin, Demerol, all these controlled substances. You can't just go to the drugstore and buy what you want. They're controlled by federal law as to who can get a prescription for what. Well, just as Jews on Friday night like to break a bread, Christians like to have some red wine on Sunday, other people practice their religion in certain other ways, their habits, idiosyncrasies, customs. In Oregon, there were a group of Indians who used peyote for their religious exercise. And peyote was and is a controlled substance. They didn't get permission, they didn't have a prescription, they simply used peyote. I don't know whether you eat it, smell it, smoke it, I don't know what you do. But they used peyote, and they were arrested. And the case percolated through the courts as a pure example of the free exercise of these Native Americans violating a neutral rule of general applicability, which in this case was the Controlled Substance Act. And it finally worked its way up to the Supreme Court, and Justice Scalia wrote the decision. And what do you think he decided? He had to decide either free exercise or neutral rule of general applicability. One of the two has to win. And Scalia, it may surprise you, it may not, came down harshly that neutral rules of general applicability win over the free exercise of religion, exactly as the Mormon case had been decided, because otherwise we would have every religion all across the country doing all kinds of crazy things, violating and ignoring any neutral rule. And everybody just does what they want. And there would be no sense in having any control for the common good, even though in certain instances it violates one's free exercise of religion. And so this was a really, really big case in 1990, which may have surprised some people because it really isn't a liberal or conservative issue. It's free exercise versus neutral rule. And Scalia wrote the decision. Well, it turned out that now this was saying that various religions cannot practice as they wish if their wishes violate a neutral rule of general applicability, even though free exercise is guaranteed in the First Amendment. And so what happened? In Congress, there were a number of senators and representatives who were horrified at what occurred on the Supreme Court in denying these Native Americans the use of peyote. And so two senators got together, Orrin Hatch from Utah and Ted Kennedy from Massachusetts, and together they put together a law called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was an absolutely clever title that was totally wrong. They weren't restoring anything. The law didn't restore anything. But what it said is that it was designed to reverse Scalia's decision, and essentially said that the free exercise of religion will trump a neutral rule of general applicability, and that religion will be held to a higher value than neutral rules of general applicability unless the governing body, whoever passed the law, can prove that they have a compelling interest in that neutral rule and that affects as few people as possible. Then the burden is on the legislature, which passes this neutral rule. But if they can't prove in front of a court of law that they have a compelling interest, then the religion will trump the neutral rule of general applicability. We understand what the law said in general terms? Okay? Okay, and all of you should have copies. Do all of you have the sheets with the two laws? Okay. Obviously not the... Anybody need one? Faye, raise your hand, because I want you all to go home with this. And admittedly, it's not the entire law, but it'll give you an idea of what it's all about. And you can certainly type it into Google and get the whole thing. Okay, so now we have a federal law which reversed Scalia and essentially would reverse the Mormon case in favor of Yoder and Wisconsin, right? So now the Amish, if you follow the logic, can ignore the neutral rule and pursue their religion. All right, and this was brought up to the Senate and the House of Representatives. It was brought up at a time that most people were not in the chamber. They took a voice vote. It was considered to be unanimous. And then it was sent to President Bill Clinton, and he signed it. It turns out, probably, but I haven't interviewed Bill. It turns out that it may be, but maybe not. Bill Clinton had no idea what he was releasing by signing this law and how much turmoil this was going to cause, and which now ends in Hanover. Not ends, but we see it in Hanover. So then what happened? This Religious Freedom Restoration Act, known as RFRA, was then applied in Texas, in the city of Bourne, Texas, with a Roman Catholic priest. And his case, wanting to exercise the free exercise of religion in terms of the size of their church and the zoning laws in Texas. Because you see, zoning laws are neutral rules of general applicability. You can build this here, but you can't. That's a residential neighborhood. This is a business district. Churches are allowed, churches are not allowed, movie theaters, et cetera, et cetera. Those are neutral rules. And essentially what RFRA said was that religion trumps neutral rules of general applicability. And so the case down in Texas was brought all the way to the Supreme Court, and Justice Kennedy, in a very well thought out decision, essentially said that as written by Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy, that law could not apply to local districts, whether state or local. It was not written correctly. And I could go into it, but it's too technical. But just suffice it to say that the Supreme Court found that RFRA, while it could apply to federal laws, if there were federal laws that interfered with the free exercise of religion, such as marriage, then RFRA would apply, but not to local or state laws. And so following this decision, which came from the state of Texas up to Kennedy, the same two senators sat down and said, okay, we're going to rewrite the law, and we're going to have some constitutional experts sit down with us to help us draft this law so it will pass muster at the Supreme Court. And so that law became known, the second law, in 2000, as the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. Let's take the first part first. Religious land use. It had nothing to do with marriage, it had nothing to do with anything else except religious land use, whether churches can use certain lands or whether they can ignore local zoning laws. There's no question that Orrin Hatch and maybe Ted Kennedy, I'm not sure, had in mind the idea of sizes of churches should be whatever the church wants, ignoring zoning laws. And neutral zoning laws should not trump the free exercise of religion, despite the size of the church in a neighborhood. The second half of the law, which has nothing to do with us right here in Hanover, is the Institutionalized Persons Act, which essentially was a result of Charlie Colson. You remember Chuck Colson? He was one of the bad guys with Nixon. And he went to prison for about 7 months in Florida, and his time in prison convinced him to bring religion into jails, penitentiaries, and which he did. He devoted the rest of his life to bringing religion into prisons. And it was through his efforts that they decided within this religious land use to tack on Institutionalized Persons Act. So I'm going to just say 2 sentences about that and leave it, but essentially what it says, and is wreaking havoc across the country, is that any prisoner in any prison, whether it's New Hampshire, federal, Sing Sing, Terre Haute, wherever, if you are Jewish and you feel that your religion dictates you have to have kosher food, the kitchen at this prison in the middle of Indiana or Idaho must somehow get you some kosher food. Or if you're a Mormon and you're locked up, you need to have the Quran and a prayer, whatever you need. And Christians have to have wine on Sunday. And everybody needs to have, so that they have the free exercise of their religion, because they've been locked up by the federal government or a state government. And therefore, because of this law, and I can tell you, it's wreaking havoc across the country within the prison systems because of this law that was mostly put forward by Charlie Colson, who was one of the bad guys with Nixon. Okay, that's the Institutionalized Persons Act. The first half of the law is religious land use. The acronym now for this law is RLUIPA, and that's how everybody refers to it. Without going through the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, it's RLUIPA. And we're going to just now pay attention to the first part, religious land use, and see what's happened. So, according to this law, here's what has to happen. The religious entity must show that the zoning laws in which they want to build a church or enlarge a church, they must show, if the zoning law doesn't allow them to do what they want, the church must show that the zoning law creates a substantial burden for the church. That is what's necessary. And they simply have to come up and make a case that your zoning law presents to us a substantial burden. And that's not allowed by this law. Free exercise of religion wins. But the city, in order for it to win, must prove what is essentially the strict scrutiny rule, that they have a compelling interest in that zoning law, and that zoning law restricts as few people or affects as few people as possible. And I can tell you across the country, it is almost, not quite, but almost impossible to prove a compelling interest. Almost impossible. It is such a high standard. And so, essentially, every one of these cases, almost, not quite, but great majority of the cases in which a church is complaining about a substantial burden put on them by the zoning ordinance, they usually win. Because the city finds it very difficult to prove not a good interest, a strong interest, an aesthetic interest. That is not a compelling interest. So those are the two sides that are against each other because of this religious land use case. Now, also built into this law, favoring religion, was a paragraph which states that if we get into a legal battle between the city and a church, and the church wins and the city loses, the city must pay the legal fees for not only itself, but the church's legal fees. And so the longer a city fights the church, the higher their bill. And their bill comes from taxes. And the taxes are being spent to fight the church, which has on its side the religious land use law. Yes?
Is the reverse also true? Is the city wins and must the church?
No.
It's one way.
It's one way. If the city wins, then the city pays its lawyers and the church pays its lawyers. It's written to favor the free exercise of religion. No question about it. Diane.
Just that this law has led to those enormous megachurches.
We're going to see that in a minute. We're going to see that in a minute. Okay, but I want you to understand what the law is stating and what the burdens are on both sides. Yeah?
Can you just say what one of the compelling uses was?
What a compelling use might be?
That actually won against this.
I'm sorry?
Like the compelling use that won against this.
Compelling interest. Compelling.
What one might be?
Yeah, you said that most of them have lost.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to come to it. Okay. So now, how do you learn about this, and who's the expert? There's no question there is one expert in the country. Her name is Marcy Hamilton. She's a law professor in New York, and this is her book, God versus the Gavel. It's a really clear book, really clearly written, easily understood, understands both sides. And this is, if you're interested in following this is a complete story of understanding what's going on. Marcy Hamilton, God, and the Gavel. Okay. Now, I want to share with you now what one of you just mentioned, what the fallout has been, what the results have been because of this law. And I'm not making this up. I just want to present to you the facts, ma'am, just the facts.
The story we're about to see is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent.
Okay, so someone asked me, well, what has been the result of this law, which pits churches against zoning laws? While we may not be aware of it in Hanover, there have been a plethora of what has become known as megachurches across the country. A few years ago, I used to drive from here to California every winter, and I would first quickly try to drive south as far as I could in Virginia to get out of the snow, and then enjoy going west from Virginia, South Carolina. And I can tell you that going from Virginia to Southern California, you go right through what is euphemistically called the Bible Belt. And let me show you what you will see. A sampling. This is now a church built on a piece of property that was not zoned for a church, but which was built in lieu of the zoning law. Here's another one. These are not small structures, and mega churches by definition, perhaps euphemistically, are referred to any congregation larger than 2,000 seats is called a megachurch. Another example in a quiet, leafy neighborhood. Another one. This is not made up. This is a joke. And the point is, it's really not of great interest, except that none of these buildings would have been allowed by the local zoning law. But the church prevailed because of the religious land use law written by Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch and signed by Bill Clinton. How about another one? Now, what if one stands back as Sergeant Friday would do, and what are the facts? What happens at these churches for which they have complete freedom to do so? There are now daycare centers as part of the church, homeless shelters, clinics, hospitals, food kitchens, movie theaters, and even bowling alleys as part of the church enterprise, which has been allowed because of the religious land use case. And here's an example of a church that went up, but right away they put in a daycare center. So now the neighborhood has lots of children, which was never the case and was not part of the zoning law, but the neutral rule of general applicability zoning laws were trumped by religious land use. And so what do the insides of some of these churches look like? Well, let me share how successful they've been. This is not a little issue. This is a big deal, and it's happening across the country. Now, you may say justifiably so, this is fabulous. Look at all these people enjoying themselves and exercising their religion. They're free to exercise their religion, and the local crazy zoning laws are not preventing them anymore. Yay for the religious land use case. So you get an idea, just the facts, ma'am, of what has happened because of this religious land use case. Now, this is sort of an interesting map to see where and how many, and mega churches are defined as 2,000 or more, and you can pick out your favorite state and see how many of these churches of 2,000 or more have sprouted up because of the religious land use law.
David, it's not just churches, it's mosques.
Mosque, any religious organization. Could be a synagogue, mosque. I use the church loosely. Synagogue, mosque, church. And this gives you an idea. New Hampshire has 2. But take a look at these other states. Sorry about the clarity. But you see, this is a major impact on what is happening simply because of the religious land use law. Now, Faye, my wife, asked a really interesting question, which you asked in the back just a few minutes ago. As I was explaining all this to Faye a few weeks ago, and we were going over this, and Faye, very well aware that the state, the nation has to come up in order to win with a compelling interest. And if they can't come up with a compelling interest, then they lose. And Faye asked me, what might be a compelling interest in which the city would trump the church's religious land use? Can any of you think of an example, a hypothetical as we call them? Yes?
Well, I'm not sure this would run the gamut, but it would be very interesting to see whether, hear from you, whether the impact on the character of a community, a residential community in and around a particular parcel of land might be the basis for arguing that there is a compelling interest.
That's right, and that can be tried. And in fact, that is what,
My real question is, I know it's an open question and it's very difficult to resolve, but has there been any judicial attention to that kind of thing in another context?
well, in that context, there certainly has, and we're going to hear about it shortly in Hanover, of what's happening here. But I want to go back, Steve, to the question that Faye asked me of what might be, you're saying that the aesthetics, the neighborhood, could be argued to be a compelling interest. It certainly could be.
It's even broader than that.
Okay.
So, wetlands impacts.
Yep, that's a compelling interest, might be a compelling interest. Steve?
Church of 2000 would need highway infrastructure to reach it, and it would be a compelling interest as to whether or not to build a road or other infrastructure to
That's right.
go to that.
Highways, driveways, parking, lights, noise, etc. All that's part of it. Tom?
Yeah, it would have potentially an adverse impact on the taxation as the neighborhood is crowded with kindergartens and what have you. Values of property go down, people move out, and thus a source of income for the community is jeopardized.
That exact argument, and I don't mean to say, I don't want you to go out here saying that David said, because I didn't. David said that all church cases win and all zoning cases lose. I did not say that. The most recent example is from the Sixth Circuit in Ohio. This is the Sixth Circuit Court, which was faced with a situation in Ohio. The church wanted to buy a big building. The church was there, but wanted to buy a big building next door, really big and enlarge. And the city made the argument that if the church did that, they would be losing this enormous amount of revenue, which they needed from the tax base that this commercial building produced in taxes. And the courts in Ohio bought the argument, and the Sixth Circuit affirmed it. So in that case, the compelling interest was the city arguing they needed the money. I don't know, but that is the decision, and as a result, and a few others, there are splits when this percolates up to the circuit courts around the country, how the circuit courts handle it. And I can give you that one example of the Sixth Circuit in Ohio, where the Sixth Circuit sided with the town and the compelling interest, we need the tax money. And the church, it's more compelling interest to the city than the church needing this extra building. However, I'm sorry? No, if Joe asked what happened after the Sixth Circuit, that's a very good question, and the decision was appealed by the church to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court voted not to hear it. And so the Supreme Court has not ruled on any religious land use case, but they have ruled on the Institutionalized Persons Act and upheld it. So that's where it stands with the Supreme Court, but circuit courts and lower courts have split across the country. So it's not for sure that a church is going to win or lose. There have been examples both ways. But I still think Faye's question was a really good one. And I was trying to think, what would be a compelling interest that by a city or a state or a country by which the neutral rule would win and the church would lose. And I thought of the recent news articles, which is a complete example of the intersection of church and state. It's perfect. That's what it is, an intersection of church and state. And it's this: vaccinations. There are groups who sincerely believe religiously that it is against their religion for their children to be vaccinated. And on the basis of the free exercise of their religion, they refuse to have their children vaccinated. And this all came about because of measles and an epidemic. And people are out protesting that the free exercise of their religion, as evidenced by the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, free exercise should win over a law that says that everybody in New Hampshire between the ages of 2 and 8 needs to be vaccinated against measles is what kind of a law? It's a neutral rule of general applicability. It's not saying only Protestant children or Jewish children or Mohammedan children, Muslim children, all children for the sake of the health of the community. It's a neutral rule. And there you have it. A neutral rule versus the free exercise of people's religion at the expense of the health of the community, which the legislature is trying to protect. And here is a Jewish kid objecting, and this all took place in New Jersey, just northwest of New York City, where there's a whole Orthodox community of Jews who don't want to be vaccinated. So in thinking about this, I said, Faye, there is a perfect example of a compelling interest by a community. That's, I would argue, a compelling interest, the health of the community. And the neutral rule, if I were the judge, would trump the free exercise of religion. Now, a little side note to this. My son is a rabbi, and I called Aaron in Pittsburgh, and I said, Aaron, what is it about the Jewish religion that causes these Orthodox Jews not to want to be vaccinated? He says, absolutely nothing. It's total myth. That these people have just bought into it. There is nothing religiously about it at all. It's just sort of a rumor started in the community, and they're worried about autism and all kinds of other nonsense. And if push comes to shove, they don't even have a religious basis to stand on, because it has nothing to do with their religion. It's just that community got excited, but it's a zero in terms of religious belief. And so I'm throwing that out, let's see, as an example. But here's a more poignant one. What if there were an outbreak of Ebola? And the New Hampshire legislature found that Ebola has now been brought from Africa to New Hampshire, and they pass a law. Everybody within the next 2 weeks have to be vaccinated against Ebola. And there's some people, whatever religion, says it violates the free exercise of my religion. Do you think the court would buy that the state has a compelling interest? You bet they would. Okay, so this is an example of what would be a compelling interest, which would fly in the face of free exercise. But otherwise, if it's not compelling, in terms of zoning, the church wins. That's what I want you to take home. Now, this is just, I thought, a little interesting because of New Hampshire, where most of us are. The question is, how hard is it to get a vaccine exemption in your state? And here are the states, and it turns out that New Hampshire, it's very difficult. It's difficult in New Hampshire to get an exemption. And you can just say, this isn't key to my whole morning's argument, but I thought it was an interesting graph showing how states view this in terms of the ease with which you can claim that you don't want to be vaccinated. Now let's turn locally and what is happening in New Hampshire, down the street. This is Pastor Don Williman, who has a master's degree in theology from the Dallas Theological Seminary. He leads a church here in Hanover that has functioned in Hanover for almost 20 years. Usually 300 plus people attend his service each Sunday. The church has looked for land on which to build a church in Hanover for some 10 years and has been unable to find any land zoned appropriately so that without any question they could build a church. There is no available land downtown or in what's called the institutional zone for a 415-person church. And that is what they're claiming they need for their congregants, is a church for 415 people. Why is that? Why are they having difficulty? And we're going to come to that in a minute. But what does Pastor Williman understand? He understands clearly that the government shall not impose or implement a land use regulation in a manner that treats a religious assembly or institution on less than equal terms with a non-religious assembly or institution. Hanover did not do that. They did not treat the church differently than a non-religious organization. 2, he understands that a land use regulation shall not be implemented that discriminates against a religious organization, categorically excluding religious organizations from any jurisdiction or unreasonably limiting them within a jurisdiction. So in Hanover, a zoning ordinance was passed in 1976. And it is very easy for any of you to walk into the city office and ask for this map. And they're more than happy to give you a copy. And you can look at this right now, but that comes from what I picked up in City Hall. And I put on here to help you locate, this is Wheelock, here's Connecticut River, come up the river into town, here's the Hanover Inn, here's the Dartmouth Green, so you orient yourself. It turns out, appropriately so, that all of this dark green area is zoned institutional. And by the zoning ordinance in Hanover, any church is allowed to build whatever they wish on any property they own within that zoning district. It turns out that the area that's dark green, that's zoned institutional by Hanover, 99.5% of it is occupied by either Dartmouth College or the Hanover Public Schools. And there is no land for sale in the institutional zone. No church has been built in Hanover since 1976. And it turns out the church has learned that neither Dartmouth College nor the high school board are interested in selling any of their land. So the church has found themselves without the ability to build a church on land that is zoned for them without asking for a variance or a permit. Just to be clear, and you can pick this map up if you're interested in Town Hall, churches are allowed without any question in the institutional zone, but there is no land. They are allowed by special exception. You go and ask for permission in the areas called residence and office, general residence, single residence, SR2, and rural residence, RR. They are allowed there by special exception if they apply and the board agrees. They are absolutely not allowed under any conditions in the business and limited manufacturing, downtown, the business district, and I would have to go through each one. Every tiny square inch of town is zoned very, very carefully. And you can go here and pick this up. I have put where churches stand now. This is the Episcopal Church. This is the Catholic Church, Christian Science Church, Lutheran Church, Church of Christ. This is the Aquinas Catholic Center. This is the Roth Center. Essentially, that's it. I may have missed one or two. But essentially, that's where the churches are in Hanover. Any new churches that have been built out of town, either towards Lebanon or in another direction, but not in Hanover. Okay, they're not allowed in the business and limited manufacturing, downtown business, office or laboratory space, forestry or recreation, natural preserve, or goose pond. So there are 579 acres in the institutional zone, the green zone. Essentially 500 acres are owned by Dartmouth College, the fraternities and sororities, and another 80 acres by the Hanover School Board. So the church has found themselves stymied. A few acres by the Episcopal Church, Catholic Church, as I pointed out. The last new church was built in the institutional zone in 1960. Here, churches you'll recognize. And here is the Aquinas House that was built in 1960. And right down the street from that is Occam Ridge. And you remember I was here some 15, 18 years ago when it was announced that the Jewish group wanted to build a Jewish center, essentially right down the street from the Catholic Center. And where were they going to build it? Well, it turned out that Dartmouth wanted a Jewish center on campus, and they had the land, and they made the land available, particularly since an alumnus, Steve Roth, agreed to give them so many millions of dollars. And so the Roth Center was built on this street, not without some controversy. And it's really interesting. I went up to the office to learn what had happened, and I asked them, could I see all the stuff about the Roth Center? Whoa, they pull out all the stuff, and I could go through it and read lots and lots of articles and letters from people you know, whose names are common in town, who are up in arms that this shouldn't be built. It's going to interfere with our neighborhood. It's going to be the end of why we bought this house on Occam Pond or in this area. And they're all on public view to read, and they're there. But essentially, here we are. It was built, but it was built on on Dartmouth College land. So there was not a zoning. The only big discussion was the shape of the driveway. That was discussed for a bit, and then that ended. And so we are back now to Don Williman and the fact that he wants to build a church somewhere in Hanover. Right now, his organization has bought the church in Queechee. And this church you'll recognize is essentially almost across the street from Simon Pierce, next to the library in Queechee. And this is Christ the Redeemer Church. This is the pastor. And here are his congregants at a service in Queechee. And here he is explaining to his group what they want to do and what their goal is. And I learned that because they have been frustrated in building their own church and wanting to have services every week, they have arranged with the city for the past 10 years to rent Hanover High School auditorium. And they do that on Sunday mornings. And they hold services there and pay the city, I think I have it right, approximately $500 per Sunday, or $23,000 a year for the use of Hanover High School auditorium. And I was sort of curious as to what goes on there. And so some weeks ago, I had my coffee and told Faye I'm going to just drive over and see what goes on. And so as I drove up to the high school, this is Sunday morning, at 10:30, I could not find a parking place. It was bumper to bumper, and the entire lot down here, this is the high school parking lot, is totally full. And so I got out of the car some blocks away and walked back, and I saw the various signs. And I had no trouble being directed to where the services were going on. Now, you recognize this. We come in here to vote, the lobby of Hanover High School. And I continued walking, easy, follow the signs. There was lots of literature to pick up explaining the mission, the purpose of the church. And here's Don Williman with a musical group. And I will tell you that the auditorium was just about packed. And if I had to guess there were a lot of young people. I think more young people than old people. I would say that the average age, I don't know, I'm guessing, but maybe 35 or 30. There are a lot of young mothers with babies in their arms. A lot of young people, and it was pretty well packed. And here's another view of Hanover High School auditorium with the service going on. And this has been going on every Sunday for the past 10 years. And here is the pastor explaining to a number of his congregants what they want to do and their interest in acquiring land so they can build their own sanctuary, and the difficulty they're having in Hanover to find an appropriate place. So listen to this now.
Hello, my name is Don Williman, and I'm the founding pastor of Christ Redeemer Church here in Hanover, New Hampshire. Something exciting is happening in New England. Once again, the gospel is entering in and transforming lives and transforming communities. It's for this reason that Christ Redeemer Church is now beginning a ministry expansion campaign. Back in the fall of 2000, when we first came to this Ivy League community in order to plant a church, we came here for basically two reasons. First was the greatness of the need. This area was one of the most unchurched communities in the entire country. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, was the greatness of the opportunity. We came here because we knew that from here we could impact the entire world. And that is exactly what God has done. As a matter of fact, we have seen God send out over 600 people to every corner of the globe. And all the while, he has been growing a vibrant and missional church right here in Hanover of over 300 people. And so we are impacting this community, our friends, and our neighbors, and seeing lives transformed.
So I've loved being able to be a CRC intern this past year. It's been a really incredible opportunity because you get a chance to see what goes on behind the scenes in a church. I think it's an incredibly unique opportunity for students to see what the body of Christ looks like.
Given Christ Redeemer's focus on gospel living and building relationships and partnerships with those in Western Europe, we thought we kind of had a unique research lab that we could create this reciprocity. They could come to us and learn a gospel perspective in every aspect of what church means, and we could learn from them, from their European context, from the culture in which their gospel is situated, to help give us insight in how we can be more impactful and more helpful in the way that we steward the gospel in our context.
Being here in New Hampshire, it's been very great time for both of us to see how the gospel is lived out, and it's really things you cannot just learn from the books, you just grasp the lifestyle. So this lifestyle of pastor and teacher who is driven by gospel has just been very amazing and helpful to us to learn it, and I think it starts to shape us also when we go back and we can serve our community.
Christ Redeemer Church has always wanted to be a multiplying church, and we found that the best way to do that is by developing our own leaders. This is the purpose of our residency program. Like a medical residency, our ministry residents have the opportunity to learn real-life ministry immersed in a missional church context under the leadership of an experienced mentor. And then as they're trained and developed, they're sent out to our various revitalizing and church planting opportunities.
What's happening in Sunapee right now is really exciting. We're seeing the church growing in depth and growing in number. We're seeing new folks coming through the door regularly, and so we're praying, we're eager to continue to grow and thrive as a church.
In early 2016, we were approached by the Quechee congregation really with a great opportunity to bring a gospel ministry to that area. There's still quite a bit of work that needs to be done to the property itself, but our long-term goal is that we would bring in a pastor that is committed to preaching the gospel and also committed to serving the community.
By the grace of God, CRC has become a vibrant and missional church in one of the most influential yet gospel-parched communities in the entire United States. We're impacting one of the most prestigious universities in the entire world, training and sending out people to every corner of the globe. And through our residency and resourcing programs, we are revitalizing and planting churches all throughout New England. And we've been doing all of this without a facility. Literally, CRC has been a church out of a box, packing and unpacking a trailer every Sunday, moving in and out of a public high school facility. But now we feel that the time has come to take this to the next level. Recently, we secured a contract on a 9-acre piece of property just a mile from Dartmouth campus. Developing this land will provide a home that will function as a hub church, a worship and training facility with housing for more residents to influence not only Hanover and New England, but also the ends of the earth. And not only now, but for many generations to come. This is why we're asking you to partner with us in prayer and financial support. Would you consider giving in order to make this dream a reality?
So now let me show you what the church wants to do and the location. This is Greensboro Road. This is the road into town past the hospital. And we're talking about, this is Greensboro Road. This is the road up to the Velvet Rocks subdivision. And roughly, that is the area that the church has purchased in a rough manner on which to build the sanctuary that they want. And more exactly, this is the exact drawing of the area that they now own and intend to put up this church, which is not allowed vis-a-vis the present zoning as it is a residential area. And this is the photograph which was submitted to the city by the church showing the proposed building location. These are a couple of photographs that I took driving along. This is the area on the left that they have purchased, and this is the road into Velvet Rocks. And all of this is the area on which they want to build the church. And you can see this is exactly at the corner where you turn left up into Velvet Rocks. And this is a sketch submitted to the city of the building and the parking that they have in mind. Here's another one, and I can tell you when you go up into the city offices, there have been thousands of dollars spent, both by the church and by the city, examining the traffic, the noise, the flow, how many people, et cetera, the impact on the area that the church would bring to the community. And here is their idea of shrubbery, et cetera, that would mitigate the exposure of the building, trying to keep it in line with the homes up and down the street. And this is what the building itself, the plans for the building itself would look like. And this is a view of what they propose the church would look like with plantings and so forth in this community on this street that is essentially 100% small home residential, except for a warehouse further down that was grandfathered from way long ago, that about which there's not very much activity. Now, the neighbors argued that the proposed church will be very large and a visually jarring intrusion on the landscape. The scale of the building and the parking lot are akin to facilities in Centera Business Park, larger than the Hanover Co-op, noise, traffic, lights, and 114 cars. arguments are that adequate parking and car traffic should not be grounds to deny the special exception, which was argued by the church. The neighbors argued that the proposed church will be very large and a jarring intrusion. All of this leads to a Hanover catch-22 for the city, and they feel caught. Because on the one hand, they are spending millions in attorney's fees from religious landowners and attorneys, the city attorneys. They will be stuck with this enormous bill if the city loses, paying for both the church attorneys and their own attorneys. On the other hand, the enraged neighbors feel that if the city abandons their principles to permit a use that is inconsistent with their laws, but apparently mandated by federal law, and the city is caught between the two. And they have the federal law and they have the neighbors. And they want this like a hole in the head, this problem. And so before I turn it over to Laura, let me just bring you up to date on where the situation stands now. I showed you what the building would look like. It's expected that the services will be on Sunday with Sunday school classes, but there would be weddings, funerals, post-service gatherings. The average weekly attendance would be 400. Weekdays and evenings, there'll be office staff, youth groups, women's book clubs, men's breakfast, Boy Scouts, Little League, etc. So that's the situation. Essentially, it's giving Hanover a major headache as this catch-22 as they are caught. I arranged with this, or I was fortunate to have the video of the pastor explaining what he wants to do, and so I think it only fair that I give equal time to some of the neighbors who are opposed to this project, and so I want to introduce to you Laura and Jeff Acker. Jeff is a Dartmouth grad, and Laura from the University of New Hampshire, and here they are to explain their point of view and the neighbors' point of view as to how they see this situation playing out. There's your slide. So use your microphones and.
I got a little more nervous when I walked in here and I see my middle school English teachers here. I was feeling okay until more pressure on me now. Do you think I need that microphone?
Yeah.
Yes. All right. My children say I'm loud enough, but is that better? Does that help? Okay. First and foremost, I'm going to try not to say so much. One of the most important things to me is to be clear that this has absolutely nothing, and none of the neighbors has nothing to do with religion or it being a church. It has everything to do with our neighborhood and what we feel is our place of home. So Jeff is kind of going to interview me here because I tend to get so emotional and lose my track. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
So thank you all for coming. Can you guys, is okay? Okay. So we thought we'd start by Laura just sort of explaining a little bit of the history of the neighborhood and what the neighborhood is like and what it is that we are trying to protect. So tell us about the neighborhood.
So it's not just us, it's the whole neighborhood. And how many of you have driven up Greensboro Road in the last day, month, year, ever? Oh, this way? Okay. Thank you. And please feel free to.
Yeah, that's
right
better.
Here.
That's better.
So my family moved to Greensboro Road when I was just learning to walk, so we've been there for about 46 years. When we moved there, I'm not going to tell you a big history about my life or anything, but when we moved there, the sewer actually emptied into Mink Brook. So we have seen lots of things changing. Mink Brook now is pristine. The reason why we love living there so much is because essentially you feel like you're in the country, but you're a mile from town. And it's quiet. And I can tell you that, so this is our house is where that one big tree is there. My mom lives just down the road. My parents bought this house as an investment years ago, hoping that one day my brother and I would come home and take care of them, which is exactly what we did, or I did, rather. I moved away, and I came back. And I came back because I wanted to live in that house in this neighborhood. All of my childhood friends, parents still live in the neighborhood. We have second, third, fourth, and I think even fifth generation. So that's not a neighborhood in transition. We've all lived there for a really long time. And what we like about it is that it's quiet and it's residential. And Mink Brook is in the backyard. I mean, I believe 100% that my backyard is the most beautiful place in the world. We've raised our 5 children there, and I love it. And I don't see how having a building that is 8 times the size of my home with a parking lot that is an acre, essentially an acre of parking with lights, how that fits into the character of our neighborhood.
So what did you think when you first heard that a church was proposed there? What were your first thoughts about a church?
So we got a very nice letter in the mail from the pastor inviting us to come and meet them because they wanted to get a feel for the neighborhood and the neighbors. And we all thought, great, a nice New England church. You know, you look at the Etna Church and you think it has a just a little parking lot, and it has ball fields. I mean, all of our kids have probably played there, grandkids have played there. It's a nice feeling, so you have a church on Sunday. Churches are great neighbors. Maybe there's choir practice on a Thursday night, and then you have Sundays. And so we went and we met the pastor and a couple people, and it was very nice. But then
we saw the actual proposal.
Right, so then we saw the proposal.
And it turns out that this church is not a traditional New England church, which is what the zoning ordinance considers would be appropriate for a residential neighborhood. This church is 2.5 times larger than the Etna Church with Trumbull Hall attached. It's 3 times larger than the Hanover Center Church, and it's 950% larger than the average house in the neighborhood. 950% larger. It's not a traditional New England church, and it's going to have a building like that with that type of investment and all the things that are proposed to be done there is going to be used very intensively. So tell us a little bit about the traffic concerns, why don't you?
Well, so if you have 415 people coming, Sundays, guaranteed on Sundays. We'll all know Sundays, but we won't know any other time that they have people there. And this is as the chairwoman of the Hanover Zoning Board said, she came to Greensboro Road, which I invite you all to do. It's a lovely place. And it was 30 degrees outside, and it was 10 o'clock on a Sunday, and there are people walking, and there's a mom and dad pushing a baby stroller. And if you stand in my front yard, or my neighbor Sandy's front yard, what you'll hear on Sunday is children playing and birds chirping. We even have bald eagles. And it's beautiful and it's quiet. And the noise of 415 people arriving, and there's going to be, I think they've allowed, or the proposal is for 113 cars. Well, 113 cars, that's all of those car doors opening, closing, people walking into the building, the alarms going off. That will change how the neighborhood feels and how we are able to enjoy our homes and our sense of place and our sense of home.
And so you mentioned the parking lot, just a couple of things about that parking lot, just to put it in perspective. So that parking lot is over an acre of pavement. The pictures that Dr. Bisno showed earlier with Don up sort of standing with his congregation in that beautiful field, well, that beautiful field is going to be asphalt, all of it, stretched right to the edges, including into the wetlands boundaries, okay? That parking lot is larger than the parking lot at the Ray School, larger than the parking lot at the Hanover Co-op. And of course, because we live in the times we live, a parking lot now has to be lighted. So that parking lot will have somewhere between 12 and 15 lights on 15-foot poles that will be on whenever the church is in use after dark. The church hasn't told us when they'll be in use. The zoning board put some restrictions for time. The zoning board asked them to be done by 9 o'clock at night, not start before 7 o'clock in the morning. The church has appealed those restrictions. So we know that the church is going to be used after dark, maybe late into night, maybe overnights, maybe early in the morning. Those lights are going to have to be on. That's going to have a huge impact, obviously, excuse me, on the entire neighborhood, on the Velvet Rocks houses that look down on it, on everybody that lives on Long Greensboro Road that's going to be looking up at it. That's a huge issue. Tell us a little bit, just to keep moving, this picture up here with the flooding. Tell us a little bit about the environmental concerns.
So on Greensboro Road, in this immediate area, we've had 2 building developments, Velvet Rocks and then Silent Brook. You can't see them from the road. They're up behind the road. But what has happened is, and they have to come up with drainage plans. And what has happened is all the water that comes off Velvet Rocks, the mountain, behind, that sits behind these developments, it comes down and it nicely goes around the developments. And then in these storms, this was July of 2017. It wasn't even a named storm. It wasn't a 100-year storm. It was just happened to be a lot of rain. It floods the road and it goes through our homes. So in this particular storm, my mother has a rental house next to her home, and the water was actually flowing through the bottom, the kitchen, went through the kitchen nicely, and then out the back door. And where that water runs to is Mink Brook. Now, we've lived on Greensboro Road for 46 years. Mink Brook has flooded. We've never had any damage to our homes from Mink Brook. It's all come from water that comes across the road. So we already know that the drainage is not good enough. And interestingly, in this flood, the road washed out exactly in front of where the church proposal. It's 128 feet of road frontage. And it washed out right in front of where the church is going to be. So you're adding 60,000+ square feet of impervious surfaces to a place where we already know that it's almost impossible to handle the drainage. So, and our home happens to be, the church is set up kind of on a hill. Our house is directly downhill from that. That water is coming to our house. And after it runs through our house, it's going to go into Mink Brook. And you can imagine what comes with, all that runoff. And then, of course, we have neighbors who possibly will lose their garage in one of their rental buildings. And, it just...
No,
I could go on and on,
but
but...
Those are good points. So David made the point about the RLUIPA, and I'll turn it back to him, except to say that the first test in the RLUIPA was that the church has to show the substantial burden, and that's the first test. And so we've yet to see the compelling substantial burden to make us believe that this is something the town has to approve. So we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to make it clear to all of you that this is not a trial. My goal is to inform you of what's going on in the neighborhood and the constitutional law behind the situation. I think it's fair that I tell you where the situation stands now versus this controversy. Going back to last spring, when the church first asked for permission, I'm simplifying this, so accept that. There are mountains of papers at City Hall on this and thousands of dollars spent by both the church and the neighborhood. But initially, when the board met, the zoning board met, the church was turned down flatly. They were denied the right to build because it's a residential neighborhood, and they denied them the right to build. That was appealed by the church. They came back to the city and alerted the city to the fact that they are aware of RLUIPA and that they now have an attorney, and the attorney would be filing the appropriate papers invoking their right to build, and that their free exercise of their religion trumps the neutral rule of general applicability of the city of Hanover. And so faced with that RLUIPA challenge, the board city met and called the church back, neighborhoods, and said that we would like to reach a compromise. And we think that in all good fairness, we understand the various forces, and we are going to approve your ability to build the church where you wish on Greensboro Road with a maximum of 300 seats. And with the understanding that the windows remain closed during Sunday services so that the noise from the services don't go out into the community, and they restricted the number of hours that the church could function, all trying to reach a compromise. The church came back and said that your granting us 300 seats is appreciated, but you are denying 100 of our members the free exercise of their religion as guaranteed by the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. And therefore, we do not accept your compromise. I think we should go to mediation. And so mediation was held, and the city essentially, I'm making it very simple, but the city essentially said, okay, every week that goes by, our bills are increasing, and this is tax money that the citizens of Hanover are going to have to pay for the settlement of the attorney's fees, despite the fact that the city has insurance. Just as we have fire insurance and auto insurance, apparently the city has some sort of insurance, the details of which I don't know. And so they said, okay, you can have 400 seats. We're going to capitulate. You can have 400 seats, and what you do with the windows, and we'd like you to have certain hours and all of these other stipulations, but okay, you can do the 400 seats, essentially saying that we feel in a catch-22. I'm trying to characterize this as well as I can, and that we hope it's behind us. Well, the neighbors didn't agree with that, and they agreed to go to arbitration, and the arbitration essentially handed it to the church. The parties were not in the same room, and essentially there was a capitulation by the city, and the church was said, go ahead. The neighbors don't accept that, and they intend to sue or are suing the city because of infringement on the neighborhood. And so we've got a three-party battle. The city would like to put it behind us because the rates are going up and it's impacting every one of us. And I want to give you an example in a few minutes of what happened in southern New Hampshire, of which Julia Griffin became starkly aware. So that's essentially, in a rough way, where the situation stands. There are three parties: the neighbors, the church, and the city. The city would like to have it behind them. The church is relatively happy, and the neighbors are livid. And so roughly, that's where it stands. And so I want to share with you experiences elsewhere, because perhaps we can learn from experiences elsewhere. But how did I find out about these experiences elsewhere? Well, it goes back to Faye. I'm sitting having coffee with Faye, and I'm wondering, how am I going to learn about what's going on elsewhere? She says, David, go to Google. Now, get this. And you type in Google Alert. Just type in Google Alert. And then you can type in anything you want, whether it's Dartmouth football, or how to make a mink coat, or how to travel to Japan, or whatever you want. You can even type in RLUIPA. Just type in RLUIPA, which is what I did. And I can tell you that at least once, and usually twice a day, I get a notice of some article being published somewhere in the United States of a RLUIPA case. Whether it's from Topeka, Kansas, or Seattle, Washington, or Bangor, Maine, or Knoxville, Tennessee, it will show up on my computer because of my having typed in Google Alert, RLUIPA. Now, 2/3 of them have to do with prisons and jails, so I get rid of those. I'm not really interested in how much kosher food is having to be served in some crazy place, or how many Korans have to be bought in Nebraska. But I am interested in what's happening with land use and RLUIPA, the first half of it, and they pop up. So now let me share with you a few. This is just a smattering of situations that have occurred. What is stark and clear is that the city in its zoning across the country must not discriminate between religions, and they cannot discriminate between a religious use and a secular use. On a street on which they would allow a theater, they bloody well have to allow a church or a mosque or a synagogue. And bloody well, they can't say, well, that church is okay, but this one isn't. And I'm going to give you an example of that and what happened. But those are big, big guidelines of which the city needs to be aware. Now, here's the one that blew up at the select board in Hanover. How many of you have ever heard of Richmond, New Hampshire? Zero. Laura has, yeah. I never heard of Richmond, New Hampshire, but I got a New Hampshire map, and you know, you look down the side of where all the cities are. They have that thing, and it says J6. So I J6, and drew the lines, and there, a couple of miles south of Keene, and just north of the Massachusetts border, is a crossroad. And in this little crossroad, it's called Richmond, New Hampshire. Total population, 1,000. In that town of Richmond, New Hampshire, is a Catholic church, St. Benedict Center. They wanted to enlarge their church in this tiny, tiny town. It turns out the town didn't want the church enlarged. It turns out that the reason that the people in Richmond didn't want the church enlarged is because this particular church was as right-wing conservative as you could possibly be on every social issue, against same-sex marriage, against abortion, hating Jews, blaming Jews for everything you could imagine, on and on and on, hating gays, intolerance of homosexuals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this nice, quiet town of Richmond, New Hampshire were aghast that they didn't want this church proliferating in that town. The church was very well aware of this. They brought suit against the city. The judge slapped $1.15 million against the city for discriminating and not allowing the free exercise of religion based in large part on the city discriminating against that religion. Had it been the New England Church of Christ or some other group with different values, they might have been fine. But not tolerable is discrimination on the basis of what kind of church. And instead of substituting conservative Catholic, substitute Muslim church, an Islamic church with 2 minarets and call to prayer 5 times a day. It's the same issue, right? And so if a little town of 1,000 people can be fined in court $1.15 million, that means that every resident of Richmond, New Hampshire has a $1,000 bill added to their taxes in order to pay this judgment by their select board. That news quickly reached Hanover. You got the picture? And there was fear. And bending over backwards to not offend anybody, their religious sensibilities, the fact that they're a church, what kind of church, etc. But one doesn't know what's underneath and what sort of hostility towards Jews or Muslims or evangelicals or whatever lurks behind decisions that are made under the guise of a zoning law. And that's what is going on. The capitulation by the city of Hanover, one would have to imagine, had something to do with their learning that the church was very well aware of RLUIPA and of what happened just down the road in Richmond, New Hampshire.
David?
Yeah.
1.1 million punitive in damages, punitive or for damages?
The damage, the money then goes to the church.
It was
Yeah.
a penalty.
Yes.
So they had to pay the attorney's fees too.
And the town had to pay attorney's fees on both sides. Yes. Yes.
With all those political views, couldn't they argue that the church's tax exempt status?
Well, that's what I told you happened in Ohio. The Sixth Circuit that worked up to the Sixth Circuit, and the town won. In that case, the town won. So I'm not telling you the church wins all the time, but most of the time. And in that case, in Ohio, the town won on the basis that they made a compelling interest to Jeffrey Sutton on the Sixth Circuit Court, and he bought it. That was a compelling interest. They needed the tax money. Okay, but this happens regardless of religion. So here was a little home in New Jersey, a private home in which 10 Orthodox men, Jewish men, got together and had a Friday afternoon, Saturday morning service. Well, it didn't bother anybody, but they liked it. They were having a good time. And they invited their friends to come. Well, what eventually happened in this quiet neighborhood that nobody paid any attention to was it turned out to be a 450-member congregation because they just expanded. They built onto the home. And now they have an Orthodox Jewish congregation where, because of RLUIPA. And to deny them their free exercise of religion occurred. This is just outside of Los Angeles. But here's one in East Los Angeles with the Catholic Brothers of the Missionaries of Charity. And they believe that the basis of their praying to God is to take care of the homeless. And that's where charity begins. And they are building this huge structure under their aegis to cater to the homeless in this quiet, what was a quiet residential neighborhood in East Los Angeles on the basis of RLUIPA and their religious beliefs. And this is, quote, a good one. This is in Rockford, Illinois. And this is the Sisters of Notre Dame are going to build a 15,000 square foot barn-like winery and brewery with tastings and a nearby gift shop, a 3-story, 28,000 square foot boarding school, 80 students, kindergarten through high school, and dorms for boys and girls, all as part of their church, for which it is not zoned at all. And they're going ahead with that. And in Abington, Pennsylvania, which is well known in the circles of RLUIPA, once you get into this, you start seeing this come up. Anybody know about Abington, Pennsylvania? Yes? Outskirts of Philadelphia, is it? Yeah, tell us what you know about it.
Well, I'm just familiar with the name, but it's north and west.
Of Philly. Leafy, nice neighborhood.
I knew kids in college that had come there.
Okay. Well, apparently this is a picture in Abington, Pennsylvania, of what was a quiet nunnery in a leafy neighborhood, which was built, and it didn't bother anybody, and they're quiet, nice homes up and down the street here. And it morphed from a nunnery to a monastery. And from a monastery, it was bought and morphed into a busy Jewish congregation with hundreds of congregants coming every Sunday morning to this quiet neighborhood. Now, here's another aspect which is interesting. A state's interest in historic preservation turns out to not be a compelling interest. And so if there is a challenge between a city designating this historic building, church, synagogue, mosque, whatever it is, for historic purposes, you can't do what you want to it, and the church, synagogue, mosque wants to do it, guess who wins? The religious entity wins, and historic preservation is not a compelling interest when it is put aside, put next to the free exercise of religion. So Diane, here's Springfield, Massachusetts. Do you know about this one? No. Well, now you do. Apparently, you can look this up, the details in Springfield, Massachusetts. Diane's from Springfield, yeah? George Springfield. George, you know about this one?
I don't recognize it.
Okay.
Which one is it?
Okay. Well, at any rate, what happened here was this turned out to be an outlier, and the city wanted to change the architecture, and the church wanted to change the architecture. The city said this is prohibited by historic preservation, and it turned out that here the church argued RLUIPA that the free exercise of their religion allowed them to change, and in that case they lost, and the city won. So I'm trying to give you examples of it going both ways. The neutral rule of general applicability in Springfield won over the church. On the other hand, in cases in New York City, such as St. Bartholomew's Church here, which argued that they wanted to make changes to this church, and also in cities in California, Pittsburgh, Texas, and Seattle, historic preservation bowed to religious freedom. Historic preservation, as a general rule, is not a compelling interest. And then I was speaking with Faye's daughter and son-in-law, who now live on the West Coast, and they said, well, do you know what happened in Farmington, Connecticut? And we used to go down because they lived in Farmington, Connecticut. Any of you know Farmington, next to Hartford? Okay, do you know about this church? Okay, well, in Farmington, Connecticut, that's where Miss Porter's school is. And it's a lovely, lovely area. You know it, George? Sure. Okay, so you know Farmington, Connecticut. And Scott, Faye's son-in-law, told me over the phone that you ought to find out what happened in Farmington. I said, oh my God, I got to do that. And so I quickly looked it up. And in Farmington, here is this Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in a totally residential neighborhood. The street, you can Google. You can go up and down the street and look what's up and down the street, and here, the homes look like this. They're very expensive homes, beautiful gardens up and down this street, and apparently the group from this church quietly bought up land and bought up land and bought up land like Disney did in Orlando, without telling anyone who was buying up the land until they had enough, and then they announced, okay, we're going to build this church. This is the Mormon church for New England. And of course, the city of Farmington was aghast because they lost all the taxes from these multi-million-dollar homes, that all this land is no longer taxable. And they have this. Now you can see, and you can Google this church in Farmington, you'll see the amount of land they have. It's sort of like the Christian Science Church in Boston on Mass Ave. You know, that huge amount of land. Yeah.
I consider myself an ethical humanist. So where does, my numbers are growing in this country, where does my freedom from religion come in?
Well, if you want to buy some land and build a building and call it freedom for religion, go ahead and do that. As Marcy Hamilton makes very clear in her book, God and the Gavel, essentially what is happening, one could argue, is that there are perils and dangers inherent in this new order of religious liberty. There's now religiously motivated discrimination. Take the Hobby Lobby case, discrimination against gays, freedom to not serve people because of their sexual orientation, deny contraceptive insurance, deny a woman's right to choose based on your religion, which is what happened in Hobby Lobby, which was okayed by the Supreme Court. The freedom, it should be remembered that the freedom to believe in this country is absolute. The freedom to act is not totally free of legislative restriction or neutral rules. The belief conduct distinction should be the framework of ordered liberty. Basically, religious liberty should not harm others. But we're seeing circumstances in which the free exercise statute put together by Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy is causing this upheaval across the country. So at any rate, I wanted to find out about this church in Farmington. So I called the zoning board in Farmington. You know Sutton's Law? Anybody know Sutton's Law? Exactly. Who is that? Who said that? Yeah. Are you a physician? You're a physician. Only physicians know this law. Am I right, John? Only physicians know this law. Who was Willie Sutton? He was a bank robber. And somebody came up to Willie Sutton, who was always getting arrested and thrown in jail, because he robbed banks. And they said, Willie, why do you always rob banks? And he said, that's where the money is. Now, why do doctors know that? I knew that immediately as soon as you said that, and John too. Because we're taught that when patients come into emergency rooms and they need care immediately, you don't do this test and that test and order an endocrine and find out how much testosterone the guy's got and this and that. What you want to do is order those tests where the money is to get the answers and save the life of that patient. And you don't mess around with all this other nonsense. Just go where the money is. And that's what physicians are taught in medical school. Go where the money is. And so every physician, am I right, John? Every physician in our country knows Sutton's Law. Go where the money is. So I decided to call it Understanding Sutton's Law. I called the zoning board and asked, a very nice girl down in Farmington, I said, I'm up on Hanover, tell me about the church. Oh, yes, it's a big church. And I said, well, was RLUIPA involved? And I said, actually not. Farmington, I don't know whether they saw it coming or not, but they didn't want to get involved in loss of money and taxes, etc., with attorney's fees. And so they zoned the whole thing okay for churches. And there was no fight. The church went about it, got the money together, got the land together, and quietly, without any rancor, there may have been neighbors' rancor, but there was no legal rancor because it was zoned appropriately, so the church could go do that. She did tell me that there was a squabble over the height of the steeple, because it dwarfs any other house for miles around, the height of the steeple. But she says it's all on one floor, and as a matter of fact, the members of the Church of Latter-day Saints had an open house the first week. Everybody was welcome in to walk through, and then the doors are closed forever. And if you're not a member, you never walk back in. And so she said it was quite a hoot to walk through. And then Farmington is done, and they've got the Mormon church. Richard?
I actually did that. I walked through the building. This is a temple. It's not a church. It's a Mormon temple for northern New England. So it is the mother church center of Mormon life in New England, in northern New England. And yes, you're right that they were open house, but after that, only Mormons are admitted.
And when you saw that, you went in there, tell us about the church versus the neighborhood.
Well, it's pretty conspicuous. But that's really all I can say, except that the week that it was open, it was really a spectacular performance. You walked, there was so much help. You go in the parking lot, get in to park your car. There was a line of people there that put cloth over your shoes. You just sit there and put the cloth over your shoes so you can walk into the building. You know, it was quite an experience. And you won't be able to do that anymore unless you're Mormon.
Okay, I have 2 minutes and we're out of here. So these are my last few comments. This was, I told you, Sixth Circuit, the court split. Circuit Court split because of the decision by the Sixth Circuit in Ohio, which decided in favor of the town and their need to collect taxes. But I get these notices every day from Google Alert. And so here is Oregon and a deer and elk preserve. A deer and elk preserve. Guess what? The free exercise of religion trumps a wild animal preserve. And in the middle of this wild animal preserve, a church will be built. And lest you think it's a synagogue or a Christian church, or this is being faced across the country. I could go on and on, but this is the backyard of some building in Bayonne, New Jersey, which is going to be totally transformed into a mosque in the middle of the city. And in Troy, Michigan, they've got a major deal here.
It begins tonight with a new legal battle in the fight over a mosque.
The federal government is accusing the city of Troy of violating the religious rights of Muslims.
7 Action News reporter Kim Russell is there live right now to explain what's at the center of these allegations. Kim.
Yes, I'm live outside the Sakura Asian food restaurant on Rochester Road. And if you take a look at this property, the parking lot goes all the way to the back of the property. The city of Troy is saying that if they want to turn this into a place of worship, they have to tear up the parking lot and even demolish and move the building in order to comply with city ordinances. The Justice Department in this complaint says that's illegal.
So this goes on and on. This is the latest one 2 days ago from San Antonio, near the border, where the Second Baptist Church intends to build a huge shelter for essentially homeless children who are being mistreated by our federal government. And that's the latest. And this is my last slide, but I was interested because this came out of New Haven. Because this is such a big issue across the country, the Yale Law School has now decided to put a course as a required course in the law school curriculum, the 3-year curriculum at Yale Law School on RLUIPA. And they are now have 2 professors who are going to do this course, teaching their students to argue for and against RLUIPA, so that the students will be fully prepared when they go to Omaha or Seattle or Tucson or Maine or wherever they go. that they will have within their legal training and armamentarium the wherewithal, the facts, the arguments, etc., to argue for the town and argue, if so required, for the church. So thank you very much. I appreciate your coming. And I want to thank Laura and Jeff very much on behalf of all of us for coming. Have a good afternoon.